This video is on the quadratic formula. Now, completing the square, which was in our last video, is not necessarily a very fun thing to do, especially to try to solve for some answers. So, if we look at an equation that is in standard form, which is ax squared plus bx plus c, and we can tell that it is not factorable, and we don't want to complete the square, the easiest thing to do is to plug your numbers into the quadratic formula to find your zeros. So, it's important that you memorize or at least write down this equation, which is the quadratic formula. It is the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. This might seem extremely complicated, but it's not as complicated once you put it into practice. So let's say we have the standard form equation 2x squared minus 3x minus 2, and we want to find the zeros. Well, all we need to do is identify a, b, and c, and then plug it into the equation. So we know that a is the number that comes before x squared, so that for here would be 2. So we know that a equals 2. B is the number that comes before x, so in this equation it would be 3. And c is the last number in the equation that is not tied to an x. So that would be -2 for us. So now all we have to do is take our numbers and plug them into the quadratic equation and then simplify. So let's take the opposite of b. Well, we know that b is 3, so the opposite of b is going to be -3. And then we're going to take plus or minus the square root of, let me fix that plus sign, b squared, which we know is 3 again, so we'll take 3 squared minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is -2. And that's all under the square root sign. And that entire equation is going to be over 2 times a, which is 2. So now all we have to do is simplify this equation down, and then we'll be able to find our two answers. So let's start simplifying. We have -3 plus or minus the square root of, well, we know that 3 squared equals 9. -4 times 2 is -8, times a -2 is a positive 16. So I'm going to add a 16 on the inside of that square root sign. And then I'm going to divide it all by 2 times 2, which is 4. So now I still have some simplifying left that I can do. So I'm left with -3 plus or minus the square root of 9 plus 16 all over 4. So let's simplify the inside of that square root a little bit more. We have on the outside a -3 plus or minus the square root of 16 plus 9, which is 25, all divided by 4. Now this ends up being an easy quadratic equation because we can just simplify the square root in our heads without having to use our calculators. So we're going to take the -3 plus or minus the square root of 25, which we know to be 5, all over 4. So it might look like it's done right now, but there are two things we need to do. We need to take that -3, add the 5, and divide by 4 to find an answer. And then we also need to take the -3 and subtract 5 and divide by 4 to find our second answer. Because we know that this equation was a parabola. Looking at our original equation, we know that this is a parabola because it's got an x squared in it. And so it's going to cross the x-axis 2 times, most likely. So here we are. We need to solve these two equations. -3 plus 5 is 2 divided by 4 is 0.5. And then -3 minus 5 is a -8 divided by 4, which is a -2. So my final answer is x equals 0.5, and x equals -2. And that is your final answer. Please continue watching if you would like to see the quadratic equation done with imaginary numbers. Okay, so we have a new standard form equation, x squared plus x plus 4. Let's identify A, B, and C. A is 1, B is 1, and C is 4. So if you remember our quadratic equation or wrote it down, we'll have a -1, which is negative b, plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 1, minus 4 times 1 times 4. And that's all going to be over 2a, which is 2 times 1. So I'm just going to simplify right there and leave it at 2. So let's continue simplifying. So we get a -1 plus or minus. And let's simplify this information on the inside of my square root. I'm going to leave that 1 there, but I'm going to multiply -4 by 1, which is -4, times 4, which is -16. And that's all going to be divided by 2. Now, if you're already doing the math in your head, you'll know that this simplifies down into the square root of -15 over 2, which doesn't look right because we've been taught our whole lives that we cannot have the square root of a negative number. Now, I'm not going to go over imaginary numbers right now. I'm just going to assume that you've already learned about them in class, which we have. So, off to the side, I'm going to simplify that square root of -15. And I know that that negative number turns into an I on the outside. So I know that square root of 15i is a more simplified form of the square root of -15. Now, if you'd like to use your calculator, you can simplify square root of 15 down even further. And the square root of 15 simplifies down to 3.87i. Don't forget that I. So this is the simplified form of that square root of -15. So we can easily just rewrite our equation with our newfound information that is more simple. We have our -1 plus or minus 3.87i all over 2. So all we're going to do is solve this equation twice and we'll come up with our zeros. So to find our first zero, or our first solution, we will take -1 plus or minus, plus 3.87i all over 2. Then our second will be -1 minus 3.87i all over 2. Now, please realize that we cannot combine a number that does not have an I with a number that does have an I when we're adding. We could multiply these two together, but we cannot add them because they are apples and oranges. Same goes for here. We cannot take a -1 and subtract a -3.87i because they're apples and oranges. They're two completely different terms. So this is, in fact, the most simplified form for your equation. Here, there's your first answer and your second answer. Now on a test, I'm not going to be picky, and if you choose to just give me the answer -1 plus or minus 3.87i all over 2, I will accept that as two answers because that plus or minus shows me that you know that there are two procedures to go through to get the answer.